So I find it just a little bit ironic that y'all have a Florida rancher standing up here talking to y'all about drought and water scarcity here in the American West. And it's been very much a very sharp learning curve for me. But even though I've shifted into the world of anthropology, I've always been a farm kid. And so I grew up on a generational farm in north central Florida, and it runs pretty deep in my family history. I even worked in the livestock feed industry for a while. I even married a farmer, and still identify myself as a cattle woman first before an anthropologist. But when I came out to Wyoming for grad school and began doing research with ranchers, I quickly realized how different ranching is here in the West, especially when it comes to water. And I know some of y'all in the audience are probably thinking to yourselves, well, duh, Josie. But back home in Florida, water was just there. We have excessive rain, wetlands, swamps, ponds, and lakes, and all of that is just in my backyard. And so my experiences around water are opposite to kind of what you see out here. Flooding from hurricanes, waterlogged pastures, sinkholes. And so while we have our own set of complications with it, I never remembered water being scarce. And so I had to really confront this huge gap in my own experience and knowledge. And I was an outsider to the complexities of water and its management within a ranching context. Things like water rights, litigation, drought, even frozen water. Didn't even think about that. Never had to deal with that. But most importantly, I was truly unaware of the amount of time, the effort, and the knowledge that goes into securing, managing, and conserving water out here. And so this kind of unique, really vulnerable position for me really forced me to do some self-reflection. And I was relearning my own industry that I grew up in a completely new landscape, and through a different perspective. And so when I began doing this thesis research and started to think like an anthropologist that's kind of focusing more on economics and labor, the first question that I asked myself was, what does a rancher look like? For so long, I think the cultural image of the American rancher has really been tied to this figure of the cowboy. It's rugged, masculine, independent, right? Over time, though, it became clear that women have always been, or always played major roles within the industry. And within the past couple decades, the presence of women in ag has risen sharply, with women now making up a significantly larger share of farm and ranch operators than in past generations. And in Wyoming specifically, the percentage of women ranchers and farmers is actually higher than the national average. But yet, historically, much of this labor has been overlooked, hidden behind that romanticized image of the cowboy. And so because of this, I wanted to know what ranch work actually entails if we've basically overlooked a good chunk of the population operating in this industry. Because of this, I also wanted to know, how do women experience day-to-day ranch work? And then also, how do they view their place and role within their operations and within the industry? So after listening to women ranchers, it really made me realize that to truly understand what it takes to run a family ranch, we have to look closely at their labor. And on a family ranch, women are constantly shifting frames, moving between different types of work and responsibilities, and they wear many hats. They're the ranch hand, the bookkeeper, they're a mother, a fence fixer, a chef, financial manager. The list goes on. And so through their experiences, it becomes clear that, through women's experiences, it becomes clear that ranching is a practice of care. And so I wanted to know, how do women, how does water really complicate their care work? When they're caring for the land, their animals, natural resources like water, the business, the family, the community, and even their heritage. Because all of these forms are interconnected. And while this care work is already complex, it becomes even more so under the constant challenges and uncertainties of water. But before we dive in, just to give you all an overview of what I'll be covering. First, I'll be defining kind of what care work is. And then before we get into water, in their own words, I want to give y'all a snapshot of what women's ranch work looks like. And then we'll explore how water complicates that care work. And then we'll turn to care as stewardship and how their work, their decisions, and the ways they see themselves within the ranching operation and the broader industry contribute to the sustainability of their land, their animals, their family, and the water systems they rely on. And so before we unpack that question I asked earlier of how water complicates care, I want to clarify what care work means. And so what in the heck is care work? So, there it is. Political scientist Joanne Toronto explains that care work in the act of caring can be viewed as a species of activity that includes everything we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. And this specifically includes meeting the comprehensive needs of others, whether that's human, non-human animals, as well as spaces, environments, and entities. And so the act of care work takes time, it takes effort, and it takes knowledge. And it's intentional, and it's an intentional practice rooted in responsibility. But we all know that care itself can also be a feeling, usually that of concern or affection. However, anthropologist Kathleen Stewart really emphasizes that the everyday rhythms of care work are layered with a texture of feelings that shape relationships in daily life. And these emotions are complex. So it's important to understand that care is not always about affection, and it's not always this feel-good emotion. And so for women ranchers, this emotional side of care involve a variety of emotions, and they are often an invisible aspect of their work. The worry over a dry stock tank, the stress of a failing well, or the weight of difficult decisions. And so women ranchers describe and experience care work in different ways, depending on the task, the moment, or the stakes that are involved, showing just how intricate care work can be. But these complexities surrounding care work are intensified when water is scarce, showing us how deeply water infiltrates everyday life on a family ranch. And so women's experiences push us to rethink what ranching looks like and what it demands. And so again, before we get into water, I just want to kind of set the stage for y'all of what women's ranch work actually looks like. And these are from 5 women ranchers that I interviewed here in Albany County. So this section is, well, I do everything. Women ranchers and care work. So the first woman that I interviewed, when I asked her kind of like what her day looks like, what type of ranch work she does, this was her answer. Well, I do everything. I fence, I irrigate hay, ride, take care of the cattle. So it's a real job. And then another woman rancher explained to me, it's very physically demanding, especially right now. My father-in-law is recovering from shoulder surgery, and my mother-in-law just recently had a heart attack. So it's literally just my husband and I right now doing all of it. And this week has been very physical for me because my husband got bucked off and hurt. All the physicality lands on me this week. And then she, she further explains it's difficult because when you have to get heifers calved and your child's being potty trained and you can't have a 2-year-old out there with you in 18 inches of snow. And it's the choices that you make to try to mitigate all of that. And so we're really seeing that they're trying to manage all these tasks, ensuring that their animals are taken care of, their families are taken care of, and also their land as well. And so they're adapting to unexpected challenges like illness or injury, and are kind of expected to fill in these gaps, right, on top of the responsibilities they already have. And so they're constantly shifting frame and multitasking and being flexible. It's definitely up to me to write the checks and get it coordinated. I hold the purse strings. And so now we're adding another job to their list, right? A lot of them are also the financial managers and the administrators of their ranches. They're the CFOs. In fact, this particular woman right here identified herself as the CFO. And so, you know, she's really emphasizing just like how much work she's doing on top of this, especially with this quote, and this quote being one woman. So she has her hand in everything, and she's expected to pick up the slack wherever. And then another woman rancher that I interviewed, she noticed kind of a trend, at least in her community, where she said, the women have an office job. They work in town, and the husband doesn't. And the women probably provide health insurance and everything. And so they also provide other resources like off-ranch income, health insurance, retirement. And I know from experience that even though they have a job off the ranch, they still work on the ranch when they get home, and it's their second shift. Oh. I'll be honest, when I was breastfeeding, I was driving along checking cows. I had one kid in the sling. And so we're also seeing how there's that expectation of childcare as well on top of this, and how the parameters of childcare and domestic work are shaped by ranch work as well. And then this woman explained, I'm tired of being the rancher on call, because I would have a child in the bathtub or dinner on the stove, and I'd get the call of, I need you to come open this gate right now. And I was just expected to drop whatever I was doing inside to go help with whatever was going on. And so she's really leaning into just this emotion of having to do care work, and it's stressful, especially when she emphasized that she was tired of having to constantly multitask and shift frame. And then this woman really kind of summed it up when she said, I think we put a lot of pressure on women to do everything. Oh. And we see that they feel like they have to do everything, and then that we see that their work, that's not even related to water just yet, is really extensive. And so this care work, because it involves the ongoing labor of trying to maintain their businesses, their families, their animals, and their land, this allows it to continue to operate, right? And this is care work. And so while women's care work already weaves together these different demands, the constant challenge of managing water adds another layer of complexity to this care work. And so how does water complicate care work? When I asked one woman rancher what keeps her up at night, without hesitation, she said, water. Are we going to have enough water, or what are we going to do with it? Drought's always the number one. And then another woman also expressed similar concern. We have been dry since 2000. We've had a few good years in there for sure, but it's dry. It warms up earlier than it did, and it melts earlier. Things have changed. And then you'll make your decisions. It's probably going to be dry. And then she goes on to explain, this year has been brutal. Many of the springs are dry. I spent the summer checking the cattle to make sure they had water available, and it got worse and worse. Ultimately, we shipped our calves a couple weeks earlier because we just couldn't tolerate the lack of water. And so both of these women, I could tell they were stressed when I asked them that question of, what keeps you up at night? And especially with having to ship calves earlier than expected, that really eats into your bottom line, right? Because the market value of calves specifically is really based on weight, right? The price per pound. And so if you're shipping earlier, that means those calves are at a lighter weight. And so that can affect you for next season or your ability to pay your bills, right? A lot of these women ranchers have loans through the USDA that they operate under, right? And so that's just another challenge that goes into them trying to mitigate drought. And so and she continues. Consequently, we didn't put up very much hay. I mean, maybe a 20% hay crop. And then that combined with the lack of grass production, we always bring in hay from the farm. But we will be bringing in a lot more because we just don't have the feed resources this year. We've cut down a lot. And so she's adapting to this and cutting back on her herd size, selling her calves early because she can see that the land can't sustain it right now. And again, that's a form of care, right? And that's caring for that land. And this woman said, I want to mitigate my environmental impact by not having excess runoff into the streams. I'm not fencing off my stream banks, but I don't want to be relying on having to water out of the creek. And so here we can see that she's really trying to protect those water sources, the limited water sources that she has, and also trying to figure out how to keep her cattle from damaging the creek without having to fence it off completely because, as we know, creeks move quite a bit, streams move quite a bit, so fencing isn't always the best option. And so she's acknowledging that the negative impact her cattle have on the landscape, especially around this water source. And so she's not only trying to manage the needs of her cattle, but also the needs of the creek and her neighbors downstream as well. And then she said, and they, people outside of the community, don't always understand the importance of why people are like fighting crick. They're like, why are you so adamant about protecting this? So what? And it's like, once it's gone, it's gone. There are no wells. I think that's something about this part, especially Rock Creek watershed. There are no wells. When you see the water coming by, that's it. Once it's gone, it's gone. And so she's really expressing this frustration of communicating to people kind of outside of her community who may not really understand the severity of not having access to water and why she cares so much. And this is care work because it extends beyond physical labor to really include a form of advocacy and education. She is actively working to protect these water sources by making others aware of their importance and taking responsibility for both the well-being of her ranch and the broader community that depends on that water. And so another layer of complication, obviously with water in the ranching context, is if you don't outright own the land, you're leasing. And so when leased land does not have access to reliable water sources, hauling water becomes another physically demanding, expensive, and time-intensive chore that just add it to the list, right? So this is very common for a lot of first-generation ranchers, which is this woman right here. And she said, it's been stressful. We've had pastures up in Rock River where they have water for the first 3 weeks, and then after that, we're spending 8 hours every 3 days hauling water. So we'd spend our evenings or our weekends hauling water. And then she also followed up with that and said, there have been plenty of times when we don't have many options, where we're forced to haul water. There was no other option, right? And so we can kind of see the intensity of having to deal with this, especially when you're in charge of keeping animals alive, and that responsibility as well, and just the weight of trying to figure out your next step. And then another woman said, we're checking grass pretty much daily, checking mineral, water, especially in the summertime. We can't go a day without checking water. And so now we're adding the daily routine of monitoring water for livestock as well. So we got to add it to the list. And so water management really transforms into care work. And this woman actually explains that a worry that she has regarding water at all in her area is what happens if there's a chemical spill on I-80, say at Arlington. That would shut down everybody's water. Of course, the creek is going to be impaired. Everybody gets their water from Rock Creek. You're screwed. And so she's really highlighting, obviously, how water sources are very vulnerable to external threats, and that just requires constant awareness and contingency planning. And so women's care work includes anticipating those future risks beyond their immediate control to protect both their livestock and their land, whether it is a chemical spill, a wildfire, or disease. And this just adds another layer of stress and anxiety that comes with care work. And so this woman said, the stress is constant whether we're in a drought or not. Is the well actually pumping? We could lose all of our storage overnight. That's a constant worry. I did have a situation that we've never encountered before. We rely on a creek for winter water for our cattle, and it definitely did dry up this summer, which is typical, but it usually comes back in October when all the trees die off. And actually, it was behind my cattle until about January 12th this year. I was having to change my management, and where are the cattle going, and can they go back to water here and there? It's stressful. And so beyond these physical tasks, their care work really carries that emotional weight that is a part of water management. Constant worry, stress, this lingering anxiety, and even frustration. And these feelings are never occasional. They are embedded in those daily routines as they navigate through drought and water scarcity. But these feelings these women experience from managing water really illustrates how their care work extends beyond these immediate needs and evolves into a future-oriented practice of care that is rooted in sustaining resources over time and shaping how they understand their responsibilities within ranching. And so one woman told me, if you take care of the resources, they will take care of you. And then she goes on to explain, I think overall a lot of producers get that you can't exhaust the land's resources. And if you want to continue agriculture, you have to respect its limits. And then another woman mentioned, our main goal is to raise an animal that's adapted for our environment and for our operation. We're always trying to leave the land better than we found it. And so this really highlights women's care work being reciprocal, and they're attempting to create some, balanced reciprocity between their operations as well as the ecological systems that their ranches operate in. And so right now what we're seeing is they actually view themselves as caretakers and as stewards. And so this really reinforces the idea that care work is very future-oriented. Women ranchers are considering long-term sustainability in everyday decisions. And their care strategies include raising cattle that can withstand drought, shaping herds to match the limits of their environment. And they are managing their cattle thresholds like they are always in a drought. And most ranchers are doing this now, but I noticed a lot of women, when they talked about managing their herds, they're really trying to build an animal that can withstand long periods without water, mainly because it's healthier for that animal, right? Our ultimate focus is, what does the next generation need us to be doing today to help them out then, right? And another woman kind of followed up with, you don't want to be that generation that fails or can't do it anymore. You take a lot of pride in just passing it to your kids. And so again, they're emphasizing that this care is always forward-looking. Every decision around cattle, land, or water is made with the next generation in mind. And so the fear of being the generation that fails shows how the underlying concerns about water really sharpens their sense of responsibility. Because without that reliable water, the possibility of passing the ranch on becomes uncertain. And so care work really transforms into like a form of stewardship, right? We're managing water and land today, where managing water and land today is inseparable from ensuring the ranch's survival tomorrow. And this creates just another complicated emotion around care, which is pressure, right? Not only pressure of trying to figure out where in the heck you're going to get water for your cattle, but also the pressure of not wanting to fail, not wanting to be the generation that screws it up and lets it get sold. And this is one of my favorite quotes, just from my research in general. She says, "I think the nurturing part of women really does shine in agriculture. That's ultimately what agriculture is about. You're either nurturing animals, you're nurturing your family, or you're nurturing the land. That's what the three roles are. And I think women are really well suited to it. Men try to conquer nature, women try to nurture it and go with the flow a little more. You have to nurture and go with the flow. You can't control." And then she follows up a little bit later with this. "I think with a lot of people, they have these old paradigms of, this is the way my grandpa always did it. Legitimacy is a big deal. But I think if you're in the community that I'm now a part of, just the desire to want to do it, want to take care of the land, want to be profitable and keep agriculture around, that's legitimacy. And so there's two different types of legitimacy. I don't know how to rope. I have zero desire to learn how to rope. So does that make me not a legitimate rancher? And in some circles, yeah. But those are also the circles that I don't really want to be a part of, right? And so here she's really presenting nurturing as a mode of care that is practical, it's attentive, and it's responsive, which she perceives as a unique characteristic in women. And essentially, she's flipping the script and emphasizing that this perceived nurturing qualities women bring, like that attentiveness and that adaptability and responsiveness, are exactly what good ranching requires. And so she's really positioned care at the center of ranch work, which challenges these conventional understandings of ranching as just purely masculine, technical, extractive, it being just a man's world type of vibe, right? The good old boys club system that you definitely see with the Wyoming stock growers. I had to make a dig. I always have to make a dig sometimes. But and so on top of that, she's really redefining what it means to be a real rancher. And instead of ranching centered on some of these like masculine coded skills like roping, to her, legitimacy of what ranch work is and what a rancher looks like comes from an ethic of care. And so, just for the conclusion, ethnography really uncovers women's labor that has historically been overlooked. And their labor really reveals ranching as a practice of care, especially when you add all of their responsibilities up on a list, right? But water really complicates that care work. It's another type of labor that they have to add to the list on top of the feelings that they have around it. And so, but this care work that they do really guides future decisions in the face of environmental challenges like climate change. And so I think integrating care work and water and gender really shifts this perspective of what a rancher looks like and what ranch work actually entails. And so you're probably wondering, why does this matter, right? The power of ethnography really allows us to take a microscope to ranching operations in communities to see what is often invisible to the naked eye. And through the perspectives and experiences of these 5 women ranchers here in Albany County, ethnography revealed complex labor that has been overlooked, right? This care work takes time, takes effort, and knowledge to maintain and sustain family ranches, especially during times of pressure. And water really further complicates that care work at every turn, seeping into decisions, daily routines, and the emotional weight of ranching. And by foregrounding their experiences in their own words, we see how water is not just a resource to manage for ranchers. It's embodied in their actions, their thoughts, their emotions, their decisions, and their responsibilities. And so through their eyes, we see that water really permeates into bank statements, feed bills, the checks from the buyers, family dinners, 4-H meetings, calving heifers, and every other aspect of family ranch life. And so as we continue the work of protecting and conserving water here in the West, I think we must consider the gendered perspective revolving around water, especially within the ag context, because the ag industry does use so much water in this state. And I think we must step in and take a walk in the boots of a woman rancher and feel that weight of every drop or lack thereof, the stakes of every decision, and the deep care that keeps both land, culture, and life continuing over space and time. And so just quickly, I just want to acknowledge, obviously, the women ranchers that shared their time with me and talked to me and really opened up about some really personal things in their interviews. They are definitely the heart of this research. And I also shout out to the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research. Thank you for the opportunity to do this project and kind of look at another area that I hadn't even really looked at when I was doing my thesis research, but it was just a topic of conversation that kept coming up for them. And some of these questions that I asked them didn't even involve water in it. They just naturally brought it up every time, right? And then obviously my committee chairs, Dr. Lauren Hayes and Dr. Allison Kane. Thank you for their guidance and invaluable feedback throughout this project. And obviously the Department of Anthropology for their continued support, and also my husband, Mitch, who has listened to me rant. Whenever I would finish an interview with a woman and she was just telling me some of her challenges and difficulties, I would come home and just be like, oh my God, I couldn't imagine doing that because I'm not a mother, right? And so I don't know what that perspective feels like or what it entails. So, questions? Yeah, great question. So I interviewed a bunch of women just throughout the Intermountain West from Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado. But for this specific region here in Albany County, Out of the 5 women, only 2 were mothers. And well, actually, one of them I just found out is going to be having a baby soon, so I guess. But she didn't talk about children, obviously, in her interview. Yeah, motherhood changes the game, especially when they're having to kind of figure out their identity as well. You know, if they've been working on a ranch most of their life, they usually see themselves as a rancher. But then when you add children into the mix, then it complicates things because sometimes, you know, they refer to themselves as a mother, but then they're like, wait, no, I'm a rancher too. I had one that said that she had a bad habit of telling people, well, I'm a stay-at-home mom. And she was like, I had to correct myself and say, no, I'm a rancher. And so, yeah, especially around just the expectations of labor as well. A lot of these women are expected to do the domestic side of care work. And men do this work too, and it doesn't really get acknowledged as care, but they don't do it as much as the women do. And so with that expectation of, you know, if you're having to go monitor and checking for water, and you also have to manage a 2-year-old that's potty training at the same time, we're seeing a lot of multitasking and kind of these 2nd, 3rd, 4th shifts that happen. And it seems like their work is kind of never ending. Yeah, so when I first started doing this research and, you know, realized I wanted to focus on women, I actually went up to it was kind of a workshop up in Montana on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. And it was led by women ranchers that are Northern Cheyenne and Crow. And so it's interesting because, you know, the casual conversations that I had with them, they said that they love ranching, mainly because it was a way for them to reclaim their heritage. And it was also a way for them to kind of take back control of, you know, what's happened to them. And they feel like they have just a little bit more power. And an interesting thing that you see with the Northern Cheyenne community is that one woman rancher told me that a lot of the men have left the community to go work because there's not a lot of job opportunities up in that area. So it leaves the rest, like the lands, these operations, to the women. And so they're running most of the ranching communities in that area. And their ethic of care, it was really just fascinating, their traditional ecological knowledge in how to kind of manage and utilize water sources. And again, this balanced reciprocity with nature that they try to achieve. And their big motto is, you want to be a good ancestor. And so you want to leave the land better than you found it. Oh, yeah. Yes. Yes, absolutely. I've actually had quite a few kind of old school ranchers, male ranchers, that whenever I just kind of chit-chatted with them about, you know, this project on women ranchers, I mean, one of the first things they say is, you know, they're changing the industry and they're the future of the industry. Especially since we're not seeing, I mean, if you look at the university level, if you look at some of these ag programs at land-grant universities like Wyoming, women are actually outpacing men in enrollment in these ag programs compared to men. And one man told me that it was when he was going through vet school, out of a class of 70 back in like I think it was, he said like the late 70s, In a class of 70, there was only 2 women. And then whenever he goes to CSU vet school to help out with things or any other vet schools around the American West, he notices that's completely flipped. And so, yeah, and a lot of women have really leaned into, they know and they perceive themselves as the future of the industry. And they really do, whenever they are describing their operations and their families and the natural resources that they use, I mean, they always use either the word care or a word that's related to that. Yes. They're holding on tight to it. They're really holding on tight to it. One experience that I had, I was at a Wyoming stock growers meeting, and I was talking to this older rancher, and he heard my accent, and he was like, "Where are you from, Texas?" And I said, "No." No, not at all. I said, "No, I'm from Florida." And he just kind of gave me like a weird look of like, what in the heck? And so obviously a lot of folks out here kind of assume that Florida is not a cattle producing state and there's not a lot of ranches or anything like that. And that's kind of far from the truth. It's one of the biggest cattle producing states in the country. But, he kind of just dismissed me right off the bat. And then he just started talking about generational stuff. And he was like, "Well, I'm 3rd generation." And he was like, he said, "What are you new to this industry?" And I was like, "No, I'm 8th generation." And so that kind of changed the conversation immediately. He like flipped it immediately. And then he wanted to chit chat with me about Florida ranching and all that kind of stuff. And that was just a common experience I had whenever I was talking to, men from even just different age groups. I do think the younger ones, like my generation, millennial generation, and even Gen Z, I've noticed they're really kind of also adopting a little bit of this care ethic, especially when they're working with their wives and really relying on their wives to do a lot of like the financial management side of their natural resource management. And so they're starting to like really listen to their spouses and try to implement some of the things that they suggest. When I go to workshops, symposiums, meetings, it's usually women. And it's usually women there writing notes and taking that back home to their operations. And so, yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they do. A lot of it is kind of, they listen to those stories, but a lot of them try to talk to their parents, especially with these generational ranches where they're all living together on one ranch. And so they do listen to those stories, but there can be like a little bit of a disconnect in terms of, some of these older ranchers just think, "Oh, that's weather, that's what happens, creeks dry up and then they eventually come back, that we live in a drought state, that's just part of it, right?" But I've noticed like a lot of women ranchers that have talked to me that notice that it's way more than that. They may not say the actual word climate change, but they say variations of it, and they also acknowledge that ag has played a big part in that. And so that's why we're seeing them, again, kind of flipping the script and trying to, do a little bit of damage control as much as they can, right? And try to talk to, these older generations about, like, no, it's not the same. It is drastically changed and is getting worse. So.
Can you give Josie one more round of applause?